title slide, and it has the course number 508 in our section D11 for studies in interpersonal communications, and I'm James Arnott. Second slide. For an introduction, I would like to quote Stewart and set the tone for the learnings from this course. Interpersonal communication is the way we make meaning of our world. While one conversation does not make a relationship, the conversation becomes the relationship, and I think that's a central theme throughout the course. Next slide. The course material really was divided into 5 parts: identity, listening skills, relationships, verbal and nonverbal content, and effective problem solving. Next slide. For overarching goals for myself following this course, I would like to first evaluate my family dynamics and relationships with an eye towards improving for some of the afflicted members. I would like to apply skills in interpersonal communication learnings, enlarging the conversation to social psychology by exploring the possibility of a linkage of empathetic listening to dialectic behavior interventions. And lastly, if I really had any druthers, I'd like to be involved in some research aspect of mutual vulnerability in the development of empathy through DBT validation in interpersonal communication. Next slide, please. When we talked about identity, we had the opportunity to go online to Uniquely You and profile ourselves with the DISC model, and my actual graphs are right here in front of you, and you can see that I'm a high I, a high D, and the graph on the left is what others expect of me, and graph number 2 on the right is what I expect of myself, and they're pretty close, so I have a realistic view. And it identifies me as a high I and a high D. I'm on an active, driving, inspiring type who likes working with groups, but I need to learn to work slower and consider other people and their feelings. Next slide, please. Perception can be defined as a social and cognitive process in which people assign meanings to sensory cues. And this again comes from Stewart. And for me, it means how I perceive others and then simply how others perceive me. When I think of how I perceive others, I have to be careful that my fast thinking and snap judgments and don't allow me to make attributional errors. On the other hand, how other people perceive my patterns of cues and how they interface with their cognitive schemata will be attributions that they connect to me. The good news is that once we know what we are, we can alter our behavior to present ourselves in another way. Next slide, please. There are barriers to my interpersonal contents because I have a driving personality and behavior. I have to be more accepting and patient with people. I have to realize others may not pace as fast as I do. I need to improve the focus of my active listening skills and improve empathetic listening. Next slide. We learned some listening skills in Burley Allen and had some exercise, but a big takeaway for me was the fact that 40% of communication is listening. And active listening includes the effects of emotion on our listening, and we have to recognize that words or phrases could be hot buttons. We have to be aware of distractions, anything in the environment or competing noises when we're trying to receive messages. And the importance of nonverbal communication, as 70% of all communication, means that the nonverbal cues are 30% if the listening cues are 40%. Styles of listening also affect how we will be effective in our interpersonal communication. And we have to realize that we can float from one style to the next depending on our moods or depending on the motivations that we have. Next slide. Peterson gave us some listener and talker cards, and the real takeaway here is while he brought the message of interpersonal communication skills for counseling to a level that could be used every day in the vernacular, I forgive him some of the misdirection in science, but his listener cards and talking cards do encourage turn-taking. They do set goals so that people are on the same level and so that the conversations actually become conversations and not debates. Next slide. We also were exposed to some advanced listening skills, and Stewart reminds us that those include focusing and encouraging and reflecting on what we're listening to. He also introduced us to Schaffer's concept of mindfulness and listening in the moment and focusing that will lead to empathetic and dialogic listening as a whole. Next slide. Nonverbal content and verbal content are particular areas of interest for me, and it was nice to find a research article that would give some evidence that for emotional content, nonverbal communication is more accurate and easier than communication with words. And according to Burko and Aiken and Wolven. Meta-messaging, it's not what is said, but how it is said, was a good indication of expanding nonverbal content, because even though the words were uttered, we find that they can have much different meanings. Nonverbal communication can be supportive, can accent or contradict verbal communication, and that's nice to see in the study by Burko as well. Next slide. Problem solving. I think the major point that we were able to take away from our course with Stewart is that nexting is maybe the most important part. Whatever we're faced with as a problem, we have to find the next thing that's going to move the conversation forward. Some of the problems that we talked about were deception, betrayal, aggression, degenerative spirals, verbal aggression, psychological abuse, and even physical violence. Next slide. In order to enlarge the conversation, I wanted to introduce the works of Marshall Linehan and Alan Frusetti, who are psychologists who are well-known and well-read, and they have theories that relate to dialectical behavior activity. Next slide. What's third wave cognitive behavior theory? Well, DBT is considered to be the gold standard in borderline personality disorder and has since been adopted for other clinical uses. DBT is one of several third wave cognitive behavioral therapies, other than acceptance and commitment therapy, functional analytical psychotherapy. They focus more on what works and on a basis of acceptance of things that cannot be changed. And validation is part of the core acceptance strategy in DBT. Next slide, please. Stewart was gracious in the beginning of his book to recognize Carl Rogers, the founder of humanistic approach to psychology and empathetic listening. And new science includes newer understandings of interpersonal communications as developed by Dr. Rogers. In addition, I was able to find from doing some online search that the core of Eric Bernay's transactional analysis theory helps us in developing effective interpersonal communication skills as well. Next slide. A very interesting chart was put together, and you can see that the components of interpersonal communication match very well the functions in DBT and transactional analysis, like active listening, mindfulness, nonverbal cues, identity, affect, and anxiety. Next slide. Well, Peterson gave us the flat brain theory, and he talked to the stomach and talk and head talk, but in reality, we know that we're really talking about the limbic system, the primitive brain, which has autonomic control of emotion and behavior. And according to Mahendra's, behavior is guided by motivational states, and Mahendras is a very noted neurosurgeon and researcher, and I just put a picture up of the limbic system to remind us where it is. Next slide. I would like to suggest some further learnings that are connected to clinical validation and empathetic listening, with the development of empathy and mutual vulnerability as a possible mechanism of action in DBT. Responsiveness in relationships includes partners who convey understanding and validation, and was reported in another study by Conviello and Crocker in 2010. Next slide. This slide is a theoretical slide born of discussions and from a writing that I contributed to with a psychologist by the name of John Josseran. And I put it up here just to stimulate some additional research, which would measure nonverbal communication cues against the level of anxiety over a period of time. Well, to complete my presentation, I should have an action plan for my senior years, which is where I'm at in life already. Next slide. Well, to complete my presentation, I should have an action plan for my senior years, which is where I'm at in life already. I would like to complete this graduate program. I would like to inquire about some Fulbright opportunities, and I would like to use that in an adjunct position to be able to pass on some of the information that I think is still to be determined. Thank you very much. Next slide.